Kalista? He said. She turned her gaze upon him, but there was no hint of recognition in her eyes. Her expression was stern, as it ever had been in life. She regarded him coldly, unblinking. "We are the spear of vengeance," she replied in that voice that was not hers alone. "You are Kalista, spear of the Argent throne," said Ledros. He knew the words she would speak next before she even opened her mouth. It was the same every time. "We are Retribution," said Kalista. "Speak your pledge, or be gone." "You were niece to the king I served in life," said Ledros. "We are acquainted with each other." Kalista regarded him for a moment. Then she turned and strode away. "Our task is unfinished," she said, without looking back. "The betrayers will suffer our wrath." "Your task can never be finished," said Ledros, hurrying to keep pace. "You are trapped in a never-ending spiral. I am here to help you." "The guilty shall be punished," said Kalista, continuing to march back through the trees. "You remember this, don't you?" said Ledros, drawing the pendant from around his neck. That gave her pause, as it always did. It was the one thing Ledros had discovered that could break through her figure. Even if only for a moment, he just needed to figure out how to extend that moment. Kalista came to a halt, cocking her head to one side as she looked at the delicate pendant. She reached for it, but stopped herself before she touched it. "I tried to give this to you once," said Ledros. "You refused it." Uncertainty touched her eyes. I remember," she said. She looked at him, actually saw him. "Ledros," she said. Her voice was her own now, and for a moment she was the woman he remembered. The woman he loved. Her features softened, ever so slightly. "I could never have given you what you wanted." "I understand," said Ledros, "even if I didn't at that time." Kalista looked around, as if only now becoming aware of her surroundings. She looked at her hands, glowing from within, and as insubstantial as smoke. Ledros saw confusion, then anguish play across her face, then her features hardened. "With that, I have never brought him here," said Kalista. "All this could have been averted." "It was not your fault," said Ledros. "I knew madness had claimed him. I could have ended it before it came to this. No one would have questioned his death. No one would have mourned him." "He wasn't always that way," said Kalista. "No, but the man we knew died long before all this," Ledros said, gesturing around him. "We have a task to complete." Hope stirred within him. It was an unfamiliar feeling. "Whatever it is, we will complete it together. Just as," he said, but his words blurred out as he realized his error. The cold mask had dropped over her features, and she turned and strode away. Despair clutched at Ledros. He'd failed again, just as he had so many times before. He saw himself in the early years after their ruination, stuck in the spirits of those who had killed her in life, convinced that destroying them would free her. It hadn't. He'd spent countless years pursuing that goal, but it had amounted to nothing. He saw himself feeding the arrogant cavalry captain, Hecarim, hacking his head from his shoulders and rendering him back to the mist. That one had struck Kalista the final, fatal blow, and had long toiled seeking his end. Time and again they fought, as the years and decades and centuries rolled by, and the unseen stars turned overhead. But Hecarim was strong of will, and he returned from the black mist, of course, each time more monstrous than the last. Either way, it changed nothing. Kalista became steadily more lost as she absorbed the vengeful spirits of the mortals who pledged themselves to her, seeking her aid against their own betrayers. Once, he had brought Kalista face to face with Hecarim, a feat that had taken dozens of lesser deaths to achieve. He had believed that it was the key to finally setting her free. And he'd rejoice as he saw the now monstrous creature Hecarim skewered, a dozen spears piercing his towering frame, but banishing him to the darkness had done nothing. A moment of satisfaction, and then it was past. Nothing happened. Just another failure added to his growing tally. At one point, despair drove him towards self-destruction. The purity of the one sunrise he'd seen since blood had ceased coursing through his veins burned him, his intangible body dissipating like paper. Guilt at leaving Kalista behind clawed at him, but in that agony he had rejoiced, daring to believe he'd finally found release. Even in seeking final oblivion, he had failed, and he'd been condemned to the madness of the Black Mist once more. All the moments preceding his banishment blurred together in a never-ending cavalcade of horror and defeat. He roared as a purple-skinned sorcerer cast him back to the darkness, tearing him asunder with runic magics. The savage joy he felt as he joined the slaughter in the streets of a festering harbor city overrun with a black mist gave way to sudden pains as he blasted to nothingness by the fate of indigenous witches. He laughed as the sword impaled him from its length, but his amusement turned to agony as the blade burst into searing light, burning with the intensity of the sun. Again and again and again he'd been condemned back to the nightmarish black mist, but always he'd return. Every time he returned to a land locked in stasis, waking in the same place, the same way. A being of lesser will would have succumbed to the insanity long ago, as so many of the spirits had. But not him. Failure clung to him, but his will was as iron. His stubborn determination to free her kept him going. That was what ensured he came back over and over again. Snapping back to the present, Ledros watched Kalista stalk away from him, intent on her unending mission. A creeping melancholia settled within him. Was it all for nothing? Was Thresh right? Was his attempt to free her from her path of retribution actually selfish? She was sleepwalking through this nightmare, unaware of its true horrors. Would she thank him were he to wake her? Perhaps she would despise him, wishing he had to let her be. Lotus shook his head, trying to dislodge the insidious notion, even as a vision of Thresh, smiling predatory, appeared in his mind. "Get out of my head!" he snarled, cursing Thresh. A new idea came to him suddenly, banishing his lingering doubts and fears. There was something he hadn't tried, something he'd never considered until now. "Kalista!" he called. She did not heed him, and continued on her way, her step unrelenting. He loosened his sword belt and cast his scabbard blade to the ground. He wouldn't need it anymore. "I betrayed you," he called out. She stopped, her head whipping around, unblinking eyes locking onto him. "I should have stepped forward as soon as the order was given," Ledros continued. "I knew Hecarim was looking for any excuse to be rid of you. You'd always been the king's favorite. It all happened so fast, but I should have been faster. We could have faced them, back to back. We could have cut our way through them and been free. Together. I betrayed you with my inaction. Kalista, I failed you." Kalista's eyes narrowed, Betrayer, she intoned. An ethereal spear manifested in her grasp as she began marching toward him. Ledros unstrapped his shield and threw it aside as she broke into a loping run. He opened his arms wide, welcoming that it was to come. The first spear drove him back a step as it impaled him. His had been the true betrayal. He'd loved her, even if he'd only spoken those words aloud alone, in the darkness of night. A second spear drove through him, hurled him tremendous force. He staggered, but stubbornly remained standing. He had not stepped in to stop her being murdered. He was her real betrayer. Her third spear plunged through him, and now he dropped to both knees. He smiled, even as his strength leaked from him. Yes, this was it. This was what would finally break her from that awful, unending spiral. He was sure of it. Finish it, he said, looking up at her. Finish it and be free. They stared at each other for a moment, a pair of undying spirits, their insubstantial forms rippling with deathless energy. In that moment, Ledros felt only love. In his mind's eye, he saw her as she had been in life, regal, beautiful, strong. Death to all betrayers, she said and ran him through. Ledros' vision wavered as his form began to come apart, yet he saw Kalista's expression change. The impassive mask dropping, replaced with dawning horror. Ledros, she said, her voice now her own. Her eyes were wide and seemed to fill with shimmering tears. She rushed to be beside him as Ledros fell. What have I done? She breathed. She wanted to reassure her, but no words came forth. I did this for you. Darkness crashed in, and 10 riddles of mist reached to claim him. Kalista reached out to comfort him, but her fingers passed through his dissolving form. Her mouth moved, but he could not hear her over the roaring madness of the black mist. His armor fell to the ground and turned to dust, along with his sword. Blind terror beckoned, but he went into it gladly. Dimly, he registered a pale specter of Thresh, watching from the shadows with his fixed, hungry smile. Even the Chain's Warden's unwanted presence could not dampen Ledros' moment of victory. He'd done it. He had freed her. It was over.